Welcome to Secret Story. Dear friends, thank you very much for watching. Leave comments, put likes, share with friends and subscribe to the channel. A bit of family history. I live at home with my mom. My name is Dan and I am a 20-year-old college student. My nan also lives with us, but in another section of the home that my dad had built when he and mom first married. It is a large house, and if not for nan, I think mom would have moved into something a bit smaller just for herself and me. As I said earlier, I am 20 years old and majoring in health education at college. I have a very fit body. I have short dark red hair, more like a dark chestnut color, with bright blue eyes, and I stand about 6 feet 3 inches. My mom, Fran, is now 37 years old, also tall at about 5 feet 10 inches, weighs about 120 pounds. She also has a lighter chestnut shade to her hair, which she wears in a chignon at the base of her neck when she is at work, but when she is at home she lets it flow freely and it reaches to her waist. She also has bright blue eyes that sparkle the whole time. She is a joy to watch when she speaks to someone, as she usually has a smile on her face when talking to a person, and always makes people feel happy after a few moments in her company. Of course, she is in the real estate business and she has to speak and deal with people all the time, but she genuinely seems to enjoy the contacts that the business brings her way. Now Nan, Grace, well, what a lady she is. The majority of the time I don't see her around the house. She lives and works in her part of the house most of the day. She usually comes through to our section and nearly always prepares dinner for the three of us, as mom often has to work late. I do know that she makes jewelry to sell in some of the boutiques in town. It is beautiful work. Nan is now only about 54 to 55 years young. She had mom when she was only 17 and mom had me at about the same age. It must run in the family. Both were married at the time, so they weren't shotgun marriages, just young people in love. Nan stands about 5 feet 9 inches, she has a fuller figure than mom but had been slimmer when she was younger. The last time I saw her she was standing in her bedroom getting ready to go out to dinner with some clients. She had half turned to look in the mirror, when she caught me staring at her. Dan, what are you doing? She asked angrily. I'm sorry mom, I just couldn't pass up the opportunity to look. It doesn't come along too often. But Dan, I'm your mother. It just isn't right. Oh mom, don't be mad, I wouldn't do anything to you that you didn't want. Dan, I have to go out soon, but I think you and I had better have a talk when I come home or tomorrow at the latest, okay? Righto mom, and I'm sorry. I will see you later. You better get downstairs and have dinner with your nan. Mom arrived home about 10:30 p.m. that night, having made the sale she wanted. She was a little tipsy and very happy. Nan had already gone to bed and I was just sitting at my computer. Mom saw my light on and the door open and tapped lightly but walked straight into my room. Whoops, she just caught me. Dan, what are you doing? My goodness, what is that you are watching on your computer? I thought this was the time to tell it all. Well mom, as you will also notice they all have, so you know I was not kidding when I mentioned earlier that I'd had thoughts of you for years. Well Dan, I don't know what we are going to do about this. It is beyond my comprehension at the moment. Mom, don't be mad at me. I was just trying to be honest with you. I know you haven't got a boyfriend at the moment, and that it is a long while since you have even been out on a date, so what do you do for yourself? Mom turned towards the door and walked out and down to her own bedroom. That I was sure I had blown it now. I not told her all about the feelings I had been having. That I shut down the PC and climbed into bed, leaving the bedside lamp on so that I could read. I heard a sound and looked up. Mom stood there in the doorway dressed in a robe, watching me. She advanced into the room and came and sat beside my bed. Oh Dan, I'm sorry about tonight. I was so shocked at what you said and I couldn't believe it. And then I knew that all those things that you wanted to do to me, were the selfsame wishes I had had myself about you. Just be prepared for anything that may happen while you are there. She before me the way I had envisioned her for years. Mom, I love you so much. This is what I have wanted for so long. Please stay Dan, I love you too baby. We shouldn't be doing this. I am your mother. Mom, who is going to know? We are the only ones and I know that I can keep it a secret. I think you can too. I'm glad that I was the one who helped you achieve that then, Mom. Whenever you want another one, I'll be here for you. But I haven't finished yet. Are you ready, Mom? I collapsed as we lay quietly drifting off to sleep. Mom turned to me and said a strange thing. Dan, tomorrow I am going to let you in on another family secret. Now what could that be, you wonder? This is the continuation of a wonderful family love story, as promised in the first chapter that I have already mentioned that my mom, Nan, and I lived in the same house very comfortably. We didn't infringe on each other, and it wasn't until the relationship between my mother and myself changed that everything changed. The day after, we were sitting in the lounge room talking when Mom mentioned something about a family secret that she had to tell me. Mom, you don't have to tell me anything. I love you and nothing you tell me could ever change that, I said. Dan, maybe this could enhance the relationship for us. I hope so. Here we go then. When I was younger I had a very close relationship with my dad. Eventually Nan found out, and rather than rant and rave about it, she wanted to join in. Even after I married your father, whenever I was visiting them, both Mom, Nan, and Dad, Pa, would always ask me to join. I don't know how we got through so many years like this, but your father never found out. When he was killed, Nan and Pa came to stay so they could comfort me. Eventually, Pa passed away, but Mom and I continued to comfort each other and we still do. I am telling you this because of our changed relationship. There may be times when I will indicate that I am going to with Nan, and I don't want you to get upset with that. I will still love you. Mom, I don't know what to say to that story. As long as I can still love you, I can take you on any conditions, I answered her. I think and hope that I can be an adult about this, and I promise I won't show my jealousy. Okay, my darling boy. Think of all the things we can do together tomorrow night. Oh, and by the way, I have already told Nan about our new relationship and she seems very happy with it. After dinner that night, Mom went up to prepare for bed. As I already knew that Nan was going to join her, I excused myself and went to watch a video for a while. Nan left me and proceeded upstairs to join Mom. No one said anything. After watching TV for a couple of hours I decided to go to my room and look at on the computer, so that I could visualize Nan and Mom. As I passed Mom's bedroom, the door was half open, almost as an invitation. I glanced the opening and was so overwhelmed with what I saw. All this time I was standing at the door trying to be quiet. I knew I couldn't be quiet any longer, so I thought I had better get along to my own room. I slipped into my room and turned on the computer. They really interested me much more. I knew that I would be with Mom tomorrow. After dinner that night, Mom said she had a bad headache and was going to bed early. That shattered my dreams of another good night in her bed. That I decided to just watch some TV, and Nan informed me that she would stay upstairs and join me for a while. We watched a couple of comedy shows and then Nan surprised me when she asked if I had any other DVDs a bit more spicy than what we were watching. I told her that I had ones in my room. Well Dan, why don't we go and watch them on your TV then? I was a bit taken aback at this suggestion, but who was I to complain? Thoughts went through my mind as I decided on which one to show first. Nan, I will let you pick one out, just put it into the player, okay? I suggested that I up with a pillow, and organized one for Nan too. She grabbed the remote. She turned on the TV and was I surprised. I turned to Nan and asked her if she liked this sort of movie. Well Dan, yes I do. I know that your mom has already told you that she and I have had many years, so I thought maybe I could explain some things to you. Nan, I have to be honest with you. I watched you and Mom from Mom's doorway and I was so overcome by it. Dan, thank you for telling me that, darling. Now why don't we continue with the session that we started, Danny? Nan whispered at the end. In 15, wow Dan, at that rate, I think maybe once or twice a week will be sufficient for me, she said with a smile. As many times as you like Nan, I am there for you. And who knows? After the night, I had to stop and rethink in what direction my life was taking me. After a couple of weeks of continuous between the three of us, we got into a regular routine of who was going where and when. Saturday night was our real fun night. We would have dinner and the three of us would all settle down to watch some videos. Mom would then go to have a bath to relax, and I would follow her after about half an hour. She would be in the bedroom by then. I would come in and take the brush from her and continue to brush it until it glistened with lights. She usually only let it down when she was home. She thought it looked more businesslike when she put it in a chignon during the day. I would spend maybe 15 minutes down on the floor, then I would stand and take her by the hand. By this time we had decided to get a king-size bed so that we could accommodate all three of us when necessary. Maybe I will have to work on that idea, so the night would begin. This went on for a few hours every Saturday night. Eventually, Nan would leave and go to her own quarters. She thought that Mom and I should have as much time together as possible. We now come to the present time. After a few months of this relationship, Mom and I were in bed one night and Mom gave me the news that, "Wow, I'm gonna be a daddy," I yelled. "Well, we are going to be a mommy and daddy, and you are supposed to be a big brother." "Remember," said Mom, she had gone out purposely on a couple of dates. "Mom, don't you worry about a thing. I will be finished school by the time the baby is due and I should be able to get a good job to look after you. You won't be able to go to back work at least for a few months after the baby is born, and I want to be able to help support our child," I told her. "Okay Dan, let us worry about that at a later date. After a few months you won't be," she said laughingly. "Have you told Nan yet, Mom?" "Not yet baby, do you want to tell her?" I hopped out of bed and ran to Nan's quarters, yelling, "Nan! Nan!" Nan opened her door and asked me what was wrong. "Nothing's wrong Nan, everything is so right. I'm going to be a daddy. Me, a daddy. What do you think?" "That's wonderful darling, really great. Let's talk about this tomorrow though, it is rather late. I love you so much, Mom. I really do." By the time Mom was about 8 months along in her pregnancy, as Mom didn't have a partner, Nan was going to be in the birthing room with her. I wanted to be there but didn't think it would be appropriate as I was her son. Well, they weren't to know that the baby was mine, were they? 2 weeks before she was due Mom stopped work and stayed home to put the finalizing touches to the room we had set up as a nursery. We didn't know of the baby, we wanted it to be a surprise. It was my old room and it was next door to Mom's so that we could hear the baby. We had it painted in pale green and lemon, which would suit either a boy or girl. The day Mom's water broke started normally, except that Mom had a backache. She knew that it wouldn't be too long before she would have to go to the hospital. About 4:00 that afternoon, she was on her way to the bathroom when she had a severe pain shoot through her back and her waters broke. She called out to me and I called the ambulance and quickly got dressed. The ambulance was there in about 15 minutes and transported her to the hospital. Nan and I followed in my car. When we got to the hospital, Mom was already ensconced in the birthing room and Nan went to her immediately. In the meantime, Mom had insisted that her adult son be able to attend her as well. After all, it was his brother or sister and he was old enough to know what it was all about. By this time I had turned 21, so I did get to see my baby born after all. We had a beautiful baby girl. She weighed about 7 pounds and was 22 inches long. She had a crown of light fluffy reddish hair on her head, and I loved her the moment I saw her. They placed her in Mom's arms, who looked up at me and mouthed silently, "Kiss your daughter Daddy," I whispered to her, "You'll get yours soon Mommy." Nan came to the side of the bed then and looked at her newest and only granddaughter. She had tears in her eyes, as she looked first at Mom then at me. "Congratulations darlings, she is gorgeous." We took Mom and the baby home a couple of days later and settled her into the nursery. I then turned around and took hold of Mom firmly and kissed her gently. "Thank you my darling, for our beautiful daughter. I will always cherish you both of you." We went to meet up with Nan in the sitting room and all sat down to have a glass of champagne. Of course Mom couldn't, so she just had a glass of water. Nan then asked the big question. Have you thought of a name for her yet? Well, Nan, we had discussed it a couple of times and decided that it is all right with you we would call her Grace Frances, after you and Mom. What do you think? Oh, that would be wonderful, Dan. I would have a little Gracie to love. This arrangement still continues many years later. Please bear with the start of this chapter as it describes events over the intervening years. After a couple of years, Mom and I decided to have another baby before she was too old. We had a boy this time and named him Joseph Daniel. He was nicknamed JD by the kids at school. When Mom brought him home, our lives continued on the same track. Nan still came and joined us a couple of times a week. This seemed to work out for all of us. The children were spoiled by all of us but were also taught right and wrong and pulled up for any misbehavior. So they grew up within a firm but loving family. I eventually changed jobs from lecturing on health education to working on computers and decided to work from home. We had plenty of room for me to set up an office. Nan was getting older and not quite up to chasing the children if they got a bit unruly, so it worked out well that I could be home to give her a hand with them. Mom went back to work as a real estate agent as it was the type of work she loved, but managed to cut her hours back so that we could all be home most days when the children got home from school. We move a few years ahead. Grace Frances was ready to go to college and JD was nearly finished high school. Gracie had her 18th birthday a couple of weeks before she was to start college and we gave her a big birthday party with about 20 of her friends. I arranged it to be held at Fran's and my favorite restaurant and I am pretty sure everyone had a great time. Grace went to a club with her friends for a few hours after the party broke up and Nan, Mom and I went out way home. When we arrived home, we decided that as we had the house to ourselves for a couple of hours, that we would have a well-earned threesome. With the children home most of the time, it had been hard to sneak an evening with Nan, and I would have to make sure Grace and JD were sound asleep before I could join Mom, and we had to keep it a lot quieter than we had before. We hadn't realized that Nan had left the room while this was going on. I woke to find myself still in Mom's bed about 2 hours later and Grace was standing at the bottom of the bed with a curious look on her face. Dan, what are you doing in Mom's bed? I was silent for a moment and then I realized that it might be time to let the cat out of the bag and explain things to her. After all, she was old enough now. I asked her where JD was and she told me that he had stayed at one of his mates' places the previous night. That I woke Mom and told Grace to sit on the side of the bed. I knew this was going to be difficult, but as long as I had Mom supporting me, I hoped that we could sort this out without any rancor, especially with Grace going away to school. Mom started by hugging Gracie and holding her in her arms and telling her that we had something important to tell her and that it wasn't to be discussed outside the home. That we would tell JD when he reached his majority in a couple of years. We then explained our earlier years. We didn't mention Nan at this point. Just her mom and me was enough for her to handle. We told her how much we loved each other and her brother and that they were actually my children. We let that sink in and were surprised that she didn't scream and rant at us. She looked at me and smiled shyly and said, "Can I call you Daddy now?" I was amazed at her reaction. She told me that she always felt a very close affinity to me but never thought it was that close. She curled up beside us and cuddled her mom and then turned to me and asked me if she would be able to join Mom and myself sometimes when she came home on breaks. This was all moving too suddenly for me. I looked at Fran, Mom, as if to say, where do we go from here? I asked Gracie to go to her bed tonight and think about what we had told her and then come and discuss it with us again. That I turned in the bed and looked at Fran. What are we going to do, darling? You realize what Gracie wants. I think so, Dan, but maybe I had better have a separate talk with her this morning just to make sure she knows what she really wants. Well, let's get this one over first and then prepare ourselves to explain the whole thing over again to JD. I don't think that will be so hard though. Boys seem to be more willing to accept different behaviors. When we eventually got up, Fran went to Grace's room and I went downstairs to let Nan know what happened and to start breakfast. I explained to Nan that I hadn't included her in the mix for the moment, but if she wanted to, she could tell Grace about her part in the relationships, once she got used to the idea of Fran and myself. I also told her that Grace now knew that I was her father and wanted to join. Fran came downstairs after speaking with Grace and told us both that Grace still wanted to join her mom and dad in a family fest. So, we proceeded to make plans for the next weekend. Firstly, we had to make sure that JD was not in the house. Grace thought she could arrange for him to stay over with one of his mates. Looks like there will have to be another chapter added. We now come to the years when we have had to explain to our daughter that her mom and brother are really her mom and dad. After hearing this, Gracie seemed to take it very well. That was quite a surprise, I can tell you. A bolt from the blue. Fran advised her to sleep on it that night and she would come and speak to her in the morning. With that, Gracie went to her room. Fran went in to see her the next morning and they sat and talked for about an hour. In the meantime, I had gone downstairs to tell Nan about what had happened. I told her that I had not included her in the family romp but that she could do so herself if she wanted to. Once Gracie had got used to the idea of her mom and me. We left it at that for the time being. A couple of weeks after this discussion, Gracie came home from a girls' night out and stopped by our bedroom door. Fran and I were just lying talking at the time and invited Gracie to come in and join the conversation. That we all curled up that night and cuddled and slept. The next morning I was awoke. I looked down and it was Gracie. I looked over at Fran, but she wasn't there. This sent me into another world. We just looked into each other's eyes and smiled. We then went downstairs and joined Nan and Mom for breakfast. JD came home later that day, after a couple of years of servicing all my beautiful ladies. Nan, Mom and Gracie, the time had come to introduce JD to the family festivities. He had just turned 18 and Fran, my mom, and Grace, my Nan, both decided they were going to think up a way for them to seduce my boy, JD. That I had already explained the facts of life to him a few years earlier. One night when we had all finished dinner, Grace and Fran asked JD to join them in Nan's bedroom as they had something to discuss with him. He followed them to the room, leaving young Gracie and myself alone. Of course, we took advantage of that. We were so used to each other by now that we knew just what buttons to push to get the other one ready. That I did eventually and just in time. Fran came out and told us that she had left JD with Nan and he had taken the news of the family fest very well. We all met the next morning for breakfast. Before Fran and JD joined us, Nan brought us up to date with what had happened with JD and herself. When we had all congregated for breakfast, including Fran and JD, everyone had big smiles on their faces. JD knew that his sister was next. I think it is okay to say that I had eventually found someone to help me. Young JD had now been initiated into the family festivities with his Nan and Mom. He still had to gain a place with his sister, Gracie. She was 2 years older than him and had been in the family fun for the last 2 years since she turned 18. JD continued servicing both his Nan and Mom for about 12 months. He told his dad, Dan, that he was learning all that he could before he approached Gracie. And that he wanted to plan her as a 21st birthday surprise for her, the day of the party, Dan to Gracie late in the afternoon. Then they were joined by Nan and Mom. Gracie never expected such a great birthday. That night there were quite a few of her friends invited, but JD had told her not to make any plans for after the party as he had a big surprise for her. When all the guests had gone and Nan, Mom and Dan were cleaning up, JD asked Gracie to meet him upstairs in her room where he could give her the present he had promised her. Gracie slipped upstairs and sat on the side of the bed waiting for JD. She wondered what it was that he was going to give her, especially away from the rest of the family. JD came to the door of her room and stood there looking at her. "I think you know already what I am going to give you, sis," he said in a hushed tone. "I hope it is what I have been thinking of all night," Gracie replied shyly. She smiled at him. JD did use all his learned lessons in the process. Even though he continued to assist his dad with both Nan and Mom, he made Gracie his priority. JD informed his family that he was not interested in any other girl and eventually, he and Gracie were going to move to be somewhere they could live as man and wife. They felt so comfortable together that they made future plans to leave town and settle as man and wife somewhere no one knew that they were brother and sister. They really wanted to create a family of their own. Of course, Mom and Nan would be welcome to visit at any time. They didn't want to miss out on any family fun. Eventually, JD and Gracie found themselves a house in a small town about 200 miles from their hometown. They settled into the community and proceeded to produce a family of their own. They firstly had a son who they called Dan, after his grandfather, who was also JD's father. A couple of years later came a little girl, and she was also named after her grandmother, Fran. As the children grew, JD and Gracie always made sure that nothing untoward happened in their presence until they were at least 18. Both children knew that their lives would change when they came of age. But were not sure in what way that would happen. Dan Jr. was the first to come of age. For his birthday, JD and Grace took both kids out to dinner and then dropped Fran at her girlfriend's place for the night. She thought that JD was going on to meet his mates for a night out. When they arrived home, JD sat his son down and gave him a beer. He then turned on the TV and he had already loaded. Gracie had disappeared to the bedroom while the boys were in the lounge room. "Yes, Dad, I love older women," replied Dan Jr. "Well, young man, I am about to make all your dreams come true," said his mother from the doorway. Dan looked around to see his mom. "Mom, what?" he said. "This is your birthday present, son. From your father and I." Gracie wandered over to the armchair where Dan was sitting and sat on the arm. "Oh. Mom," Dan whispered breathlessly. In the meantime, JD had left the sitting room and gone to his study, leaving Gracie and Dan Jr. any embarrassment. He knew that he would get to see it all another time. As he reached the zenith of his travels, he pressed his hand down onto Gracie's mound, and felt how hot and wet she was. He parted her thighs and lay between her legs. JD joined them after about half an hour and saw that both parties seemed to be very satisfied. Dan could hardly believe it. "Dad, as long as you are sure." "Well, tonight it will be just the two of you." "Okay. Whatever you say is okay with me, Dad, I love you both." So for the next 2 years there were times when Dan spent the night just with his mom and other nights he would join his dad and mom. We have eventually reached the advent of the series. Dan, whose Nan and Grandpa are also his mom and dad's father, and the same with Fran, so that is starting to get a little complicated. Don't you think? Let's have a little rundown on the original story so that we can clear it up, just a little. Firstly, Dan, the original, loved to Mom and Nan. Mom had 2 children to him and they were named Gracie Francis and Joseph Daniel. He got the nickname of JD, Gracie. It was explained that they were actually her parents. And that JD was theirs as well, and that Nan sometimes joined the festivities. So Dan decided to oblige her. These arrangements carried on for a couple of years, with Dan, Mom, Nan and Gracie all enjoying different activities with each other or together. They were all waiting for young JD to be old enough to join them. Eventually JD joined the family fun. JD and Gracie, these two were so enamored of each other that they decided to stay together and start their own family. After settling away from their hometown, they produced a son and a daughter, who they named after their grandparents, Dan Jr. and Fran. Over the years the children were raised in a loving family with all the grandparents visiting on occasion. Nan was still with Mom and Dan but not quite as active and played a more voyeur role. Now that we have come the full circle and it is time for Dan Jr. to be introduced into the lifestyle of the family. JD and Gracie sat young Dan down and set about to explain the family. He was told that his dad and mom were actually brother and sister and they had been born to his grandmother and her brother, who were also still on the scene with both of them, and even that Nan, their great-grandmother, sometimes joined in the games. Young Dan took a moment to sort this out in his mind and then asked, "Well, now what happens?" JD told him that he was arranging for him to become part of the action, if he wanted. "Wow, Dad, that sounds awesome. When can we start, and who will I get to first?" The scene was set much the same as their own had been, and young Dan was greeted by his mom strolling into the living room. He was amazed at the sight. There stood this wonderful woman who was his mom. Gracie walked over to the sofa and sat beside him. "Now Mama's gonna teach you." "I'm ready when you are, Mom." "I can't wait." Gracie took him by the hand and led him to the main bedroom. Now it's my turn, Mom. They were so in tune with each other. Young Dan lay beside her. I would, Mom. Gracie was shocked. She just realized that it was probable, as she was still young enough. Well, young man. That is something we will have to talk to your father about, okay? I can wait, Mom, but I won't stop trying, he replied. For the rest of the night. JD had slept in young Dan's bed when they all came down to breakfast in the morning. JD could see by the look on their faces that everything had gone well. Now it will be his turn to indoctrinate his baby girl, Fran, and of course young Dan will have to have his way with his sister. Copyright 2024, all rights reserved. No part of this story can be reproduced in any form or by any electronic or mechanical means without written permission from the author. All characters are fictitious, and any similarity to actual people, living or dead, events, or locales is entirely coincidental unless otherwise stated. Dear friends, thank you very much for watching. Leave comments, put likes, share with friends and subscribe to the channel.